Got it.
So, hi, I'm Dr. Arlen Meyers. I'm with the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs and MI10, and my colleague Anthony Chang. Hi, Anthony.
Good morning, everyone.
I think most of you are familiar with this format, but Anthony, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, for those of you who don't may not know me, I'm a practicing pediatric cardiologist with a background in AI.
And we're pleased to have our guest, Dale Demark, who is an attorney, and he's here to discuss some issues concerning AI law and liability. So, hi, Dale, and thanks.
Well, thank you for having me. Good morning.
Sure. So let's start off, Dale, with you sort of giving us a little background about yourself. Can you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and that kind of thing?
Sure, absolutely happy to. So I'm a partner with McDermott, Will and Emery in the Health Industry Advisory Practice Group. I've been practicing law more years than I care to state publicly, and work primarily on the provider side of the equation, so mainly with different sorts of providers, but primarily a hospital-based practice historically. And when telemedicine really started out many years ago, it was an area that I began to focus on. And so for the past 15 years or so, I have been increasingly working with different types of organizations, both traditional clients, as well as what we call non-traditional healthcare organizations and new healthcare organizations, wrestle with the issues that have arisen through the adoption of different sorts of technology in different sorts of both care settings as well as in administrative functions. And that has, of course, necessarily implicated the introduction of artificial intelligence into healthcare delivery. And this is something that I've been interested in for significantly, really, since the most recent wave of computer science advances and the new artificial intelligence technologies. I've been thinking about it and writing about it for probably close to 10 years at this point, if not longer.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to really have finally developed sufficiently where it truly is now being implemented in significant ways and creating some really very interesting questions for all of my clients.
Just out of curiosity, do you have a technology background, or just sort of like the rest of us, with the exception of a few people learning this on the fly?
My technology background is limited to Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and
Right.
Robert Stibbett. So it's I've always been interested in technology. It was not something that I pursued as a youth. I'm not smart enough, I think. But it is something that I've always been interested in, always been intrigued by the way that technology is adopted in various ways in our culture and in our economies, and the implications. And of course, also for me personally, the potential that is there is always something that is very interesting. It's very exciting, and something that I'm glad to see that we are really trying to embrace.
So this group is pretty familiar with this, but if you have a question, just a couple of suggestions. So either raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask a question, and feel free to do it at any time. Don't wait till the end, and this is more conversational. So let's start off with the why. So why, given what you do, that is providing legal advice mostly to health hospitals and systems, why are we talking about this? What's changed, or what's going on? For example, what are top of mind issues of healthcare executives when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that it really depends on which organization you speak with and how familiar they are with the technology, as well as how they're deploying it in terms of their level of interest. There is always, I think, a level of concern when I'll call it new kind of user-friendly technology is introduced to the world that individuals can find application for in their daily lives or in their daily profession, that in a professional setting such as medicine or law, the organization that views itself as being responsible for, at least to a certain degree, the deployment of these services doesn't necessarily have insight into as to its quality. And so there's always a concern about new things being introduced into a system from a qualitative perspective, which is not anything new or different about AI from any other bit of technology. But I think that artificial intelligence and the way that we see it deployed, at least in some instances, is a new concern, or maybe not quite the right way to put it, is concerning because it doesn't fit neatly into categories of other technology that are utilized. And I think kind of one way that I think about it is to ask the fundamental question, which is, what really is different about a clinical decision support tool that's driven by artificial intelligence than other bits of things that we utilize in healthcare delivery? Why is it different from a stethoscope? Why is it different?
Yeah. So Anthony, you want to respond to that? How is AI different than other technologies?
Well, just in terms of the sophistication and nuances of the technology, is probably the singular best technology we will ever develop, and probably the last big technology we will ever develop. So I think it's in a different category. I don't want to say special, but it's certainly a different category in terms of all the nuances and all the capabilities, as well as all the potential problems, and also the technology that people, including experts in the domain, understand the least. So there's some distinguishing features of AI compared to an MRI or an echo machine or a stethoscope.
So, but it's different in more specific ways, if you can elucidate. I mean, what is it that's different?
The major difference is that there is a justifiably black box optic to the technology, in a sense that even people who are experts in AI cannot always explain fully the results, the output from the technology. Whereas someone on the planet can explain to you every single little engineering nuance about a pacemaker. No one can really do that for some aspects of AI, which has never really happened before.
So I guess a translation of that would be the level of trust required to use it, because you really don't know what you're dealing with.
Well, trust is a human-derived behavior, so we can get to the point where we can trust something that we cannot explain fully, but that's going to take time.
Harvey, what are your comments?
No, I think it's interesting. If you think about it, this technology has been around for over 50 years. Ironically, Google invented this, but ChatGPT is getting all the glory. And the main thing that all that brings together is we're able to use these tools, and regular Joe Schmo can use these tools and really compensate for things that they're weak at. And I think because of that principle, it is taking off. We're getting exposure. We're able to do things. We're being more efficient. And you give these tools to anybody in this room, and I can argue that all of us have increased our productivity, our efficiency by huge margins right now. And then imagine people that have never had an opportunity to start a business. Things that are, like, for us, it's easier, but for others now it'll be easier because of these tools. And that's why I think it's such a big deal.
Dale, Anthony wants to know, what is the level of concern of hospitals being sued, and for that matter, vendors being sued, for either using or not using artificial intelligence?
I think that there is probably more concern at this point about its utilization than its lack of utilization. And I think it's because although there are some, tip of the spear users of the technology, I think the primary kind of way that the healthcare system moves is generally very slow and deliberative. And it is because of concerns about things like liability and quality. And so I think overall, hospital systems in particular are really struggling with kind of all of the different things that are implicated by these technologies being utilized. And so are really, they're talking about things like just AI governance. They're concerned about their relationships with vendors. They're concerned about people bringing their own, technologies and devices into work. So they're still wrestling with some of, I think, the very fundamental considerations of any new technology. And I think that they are trying to really understand and learn the qualifications or the indications of qualification that are being presented to them, whether it's FDA clearance or the history of utilization and research that is out there on certain types of tools and how they're being utilized. So I think it's really more that concern about, okay, should we use it? How should we use it? Than it is yet of, gee, we actually should be using it. Now, that is a broad generalization, and there are, as Harvey noted, the artificial intelligence technologies have been around for a long time, and they are utilized in different ways in different sorts of systems, and they're not all necessarily black box systems. And even when they are, there are some that in some settings that those concerns are simply not as significant. But I think when it comes to care delivery itself, again, I think the concern is probably weighted more on the side of should we be using it and how we should be using it.
So just to deep dive.
And that I asked that question, Dale, because I'm always interested in your perspective, and then especially what's happening in the real world. And it just by serendipity for today's discussion, I sat next to the CIO of HCA, which you probably know is one of the biggest health systems. And I was expecting he to disagree with him because the aspect of malpractice came up, just also by serendipity. I didn't plant that question, but the moderator asked, and he did not disagree with me. I was for sure thinking that he would disagree with me, and he's kind of neutral on AI. So he said, yeah, he can see that the health system is vulnerable if a lot of people, especially in the region, are using a particular tool, in this case, neuroimaging for strokes, and that a hospital could be named for not having an available tool to prioritize the reading from the radiologist, and the patient got in trouble. So his answer surprised me. I thought for sure he was going to go the other way, but he actually said that he would be worried about that.
So Dale, given your last comment, what in fact do these clients hire you to do? Create documents or policies or guidelines, or what do they hire you to do?
So a lot of things. So there is, as I said, a lot focused on governance, AI governance within the system, which is a little bit of a misnomer. That it's really management of artificial intelligence technology tools in various ways, being brought in through a vendor, being developed internally and utilized, being developed internally and spun out into different sorts of organizations. So we intersect with this technology in a variety of ways. But when it comes to the risk areas, we're usually talking about the different ways that an organization can ensure their level of comfort with the technology actually being used at the facility, and understanding contractually whether they have the ability to mitigate risk, and whether through practices and procedures they have the ability as well to mitigate risk. So it's again, it's still a little bit new for a lot of organizations, even ones that have been thinking about it a lot. And keep in mind, of course, that hospitals and health systems are some of the most complicated organizations from a governance and management perspective that exist. There are tons of stakeholders, lots of different people with different levels of control and functionality. And so just getting a handle on kind of what's going on is difficult in and of itself.
So Sri put up a couple of things, and this gets to causes of action. In most medical malpractice lawsuits, and let's just for the sake of everybody being on the same page. So what we're talking about is medical malpractice, which is different than product liability. Dale, can you sort of give us the Cliff's Notes on what's a tort and what do you have to prove in medical malpractice versus what do you have to prove in product liability from the standpoint of the hospital system or the doctor?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. I'll try to be as concise and clear as possible, but there is some nuance here that can be difficult to cycle through. So a tort is a civil wrong, and a civil wrong is distinguished from a criminal wrong, right? There's criminal liability and there's civil liability. And these liabilities, whether it's criminal or tort, we'll call them non-contract based, right? So you and I can enter into a contract, and if one of us fails to abide by the terms of the contract, one of us can sue the other, right? Civil and criminal wrongs are not dependent on individuals entering into any particular agreement or arrangement. They are what we consider from a societal perspective kind of baseline obligations that we owe to each other or that we owe to ourselves as an institution, as a country, as a state, as a political subdivision. So a tort is a civil wrong. It's something that we have as a society accepted as being problematic for some reason, but not something that we believe rises to the level of requiring state intervention necessarily, right? It's not something that is a crime. Now, there's overlap. Something that is a tort can also be a crime, and something that is a crime can also be a tort. And you may have seen this from time to time in the news where someone may be prosecuted for a crime that involves a particular victim that perhaps doesn't go anywhere, right? The criminal prosecution fails, but the victims then turn around and sue the person who was prosecuted civilly because they have been wronged. And if there's a basis in the civil code for that claim, they can make that claim. So a tort is this civil liability. It's this recognition that people may be harmed by the conduct of others, but it doesn't rise to the level of something that we're gonna condemn.
So the example would be defamation. I mean, we hear about in the news all the time about all these trials and who gets sued for what, but defamation would be an example of a civil tort. But as you said, so sometimes it's tried in a civil court, a state court, or sometimes it's tried in a federal or district criminal court or whatever. But there can be a civil wrong as well as a criminal wrong. Okay.
Sure, absolutely. And generally you're not going to see, I think in for example, in areas that could constitute malpractice, for example, it's rare that you see conduct in that sphere really reaching to the level of criminal responsibility. So in our world and what we're talking about, we are talking primarily about considerations about malpractice and negligence and things like that. And malpractice is just a way to talk about professional negligence, right? Negligence is this notion built into the area of tort law that's very important, and it's a very simple concept to kind of say, but it becomes very difficult in practice. And the basic concept is: are people behaving reasonably? Right? Was it reasonable for you to do something versus something else? And And I learned very quickly in law school that I was not a reasonable person in reading this case law. And it's because it gets very complicated very quickly in specific circumstances.
Right.
And unlike some areas of the law, tort liability, issues of negligence, are really determined by something we call the common law, right? It's case law. So we have a basic concept of negligence being reasonable. But instead of trying to, from a legislative perspective, writing out all of the different ways someone might be negligent, right, in a medical practice, we simply allow the courts to determine the factual basis and what that factual basis might mean under this general standard of reasonableness. So when we talk about this sort of tort liability, it always comes back to this notion of reasonableness. And it comes back to a notion of what courts in the past, right, have concluded on the basis of similar sets of facts constitute reasonable or unreasonable behavior. And so that's where the complexity really comes in. In professional liability, and particularly in medicine, there is this notion of the accepted standard of care. And if a professional operates within the standard of care as a general matter, they are not going to be found negligent. They're not going to be found guilty of an act of malpractice. And that standard of care evolves over time as the profession itself evolves. So it's this kind of constant evolution as to what that standard of care actually is.
Right. And to that point, so what determines the standard of care? Is it simply me being hired as an expert and I say, here's what the standard of care is, and the other person on the other side says, no, this is not the standard. So is it just whoever you hire to say what, or is there something more formal than that?
So the standard of care is what is commonly done in similar circumstances within the relevant community. Some courts view that as kind of what's going on within the state. Some have a much broader perspective, viewing it as what may be going on in a broader region. And yes, experts play a role in that, but it is not simply a matter of an expert saying this is what the standard of care happens to be. It's a matter of what the standard of care actually is in terms of the practice, and that's determined by practice within an institution, by medical societies, by standards set by medical boards. Really look at all of the different bits of evidence to tell you what that standard of care ultimately is. But because this is not set in stone, this is not a piece of legislation as to what constitutes the standard of care, it is determined on a case-by-case basis. And so the determiner of liability can reach a conclusion about what the standard of care is that we may not agree with, right? Or may be slightly different from what the standard of care has been defined as.
So based on what you're seeing in the case law, what is your assessment of AI at the present time as the standard of care?
Well, I haven't done a kind of survey with respect to this because, of course, there are many, many, many potential use cases and actual use cases of artificial intelligence in healthcare. Right. My sense is that it is gaining traction as the standard of care and in a variety of use cases, and that it will continue to do so over the course of time. Now, there is an interesting little bit of a dynamic here at work, because so take, for example, a diagnostic tool, or better yet, a treatment tool, right? So an AI system that spits out a treatment recommendation with respect to a certain set of factors of inputs. based on a diagnosis. The AI system may suggest something that falls within the existing standard of care, but it also may suggest something that falls outside of the existing standard of care. At that point, the clinician's decision as to which way to proceed is really going to determine whether there may be liability for a bad outcome, right? So if the clinician says, oh, I disagree with the AI, I'm going to stick to the standard of care. Well, as a general matter, if you stick to the standard of care and there's an injury at the end of the day, that's okay, right? Your liability is going to be limited because you are acting within the standard of care. If instead you say, oh, well, I'm going to accept the suggestion, I agree with the suggestion of the AI that the treatment here really should deviate from the standard of care, then that clinician is taking risk because you're deviating from the standard of care that exists with respect to that condition. So the question then becomes, well, what does it mean for utilization of artificial intelligence tools to become a part of the standard of care in that sort of a circumstance? The standard of care is a treatment, right? In the scenario that I'm talking about. So utilizing an AI tool in that context and thinking about it in terms of standard of care, it's not particularly helpful. It really just is another piece of evidence, I think, that the clinician is looking at to determine what to do with that patient. So it's not quite, in all instances, it's not quite as simple as just saying, okay, is it standard of care to utilize it? Now, there may be a different claim offered up by a patient, and I don't think that we've seen enough of these sorts of cases to determine whether there is actually a legal cognizable claim that are going to work in this circumstance, where a patient may say, using the example that I just described, well, if you had listened to the AI, right, and deviated from the standard of care, my outcomes would have been better. I wouldn't have had this harm. Or alternatively, it doesn't matter, whether you deviated from the standard of care or not. You didn't use an AI tool, so you didn't have that input. You didn't have that clinical decision support that you should have had. That may have changed your ultimate decision as to my treatment. So there's a very interesting sort of a deviation from that basic standard of care analysis that I don't think that we've seen really played out yet.
So, and thanks for people listening. I mean, there's a whole bunch of cases in the chat about who did what when and how this evolving case law. But it seems to me that the causes of action are mostly failure to diagnose, using or not using artificial intelligence, and something I want to ask you, which is lack of informed consent. So what is the obligation, in your opinion, for a health system or a doctor working for a health system or not to inform a patient that artificial intelligence is being used to diagnose or treat them?
It's a great question, and it is one that increasingly is coming up. There's I think a bit of overreaction to artificial intelligence in clinical practices. A clinician is ultimately responsible for the clinician's decision-making. They may or may not use a bit of artificial intelligence to help them get to the point where they're making the best decision they believe that they can make. And we don't have requirements for informed consent for the use of tongue depressors or stethoscopes or various other types of tools that we use in a medical setting. And so the notion of informed consent, simply because I happen to be using an artificial intelligence tool, it doesn't necessarily flow directly. And I think you really have to look at specific use cases to see whether the notion of informed consent really makes sense from a standards perspective. Now, that's my personal view That may not be the view of a state legislature.
Yeah.
It may not be the view of a court or a jury
Right.
along the way. But you can see there's this rational distinction, right? If I'm going to rely on a bit of artificial intelligence that may have, some built-in biases to it, or may not be able to tell me why I may be reaching a conclusion, that's one circumstance. And yes, informed consent makes a kind of a lot of sense there. But quite frankly, I don't see that as ever being the case in medical practice. I don't see clinicians just simply deferring their professional judgment to an AI system. So
Right.
for me, conceptually, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think, as I said before, I learned in law school that I'm not a reasonable man. So
Yeah. Fahad, have you been with us before? You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, I'm Fahad Rahman. I'm co-founder, CEO of Lumi Health, and we do work in the medication optimization space. So we use different forms of AI as well as evidence-based workflows to help doctors optimize medication therapy for patients that have heart failure and other chronic conditions. So first time joining, I know Dale, we have a good set of ongoing discussions on the side. I had a question. If I might just
Sure. Just before you ask your question, can you
Sure.
are you a technologist, a doctor, both? What's your
I'm
background?
neither, and I don't play either on TV either. I'm actually by background, I've studied neuroscience. I've been in consulting, and then I work for Geisinger Healthcare System, leading a care redesign and
Okay.
technology improvement practice. So we have both clinicians as well as technologists
Yeah.
on our team, but I'm neither.
Great. And where are you located?
I'm outside of Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia.
Good. So what's your
Dale's old
question?
stomping grounds.
Yeah. What's your question?
So my question, and Dale, thanks for the insight. I might, I'm gonna maybe take a little contrarian approach to some of this. I think that, where we're starting off in healthcare, having seen a lot of the guts at healthcare delivery myself, is that healthcare itself is like terribly accident prone. If we were to give a grade to this industry, it would be a pretty low grade if we compared it with the level of accidents and errors that we have in other industries that are non-healthcare, supply chain and transportation and so on and so forth. There's no way like the airline industry would ever accept the error rate or even half of the error rate that we have that happens when a person goes into the hospital or something is missed in the clinic, right? So I guess one of my challenges that I have with a lot of this hype around AI and, the potential like runaway scenarios is that we're already starting off from a place where, 1 out of 10 people dies because they actually go to the hospital to get care. There's iatrogenic diseases that happen, contagious diseases that they pick up. So it's not like we're starting off from a great place. And so, yes, there's like potential for AI to do aberrant things. And, you have the doctor in the loop model, which you kind of mentioned. So I guess my contrarian viewpoint is like, the errors and the problems and the excesses of the system are already like status quo so bad that why are we over indexing on the potential downside of AI rather than looking at it as, there's a lot of accidents that are happening. And maybe if we norm to some better mean with AI, it may actually help us improve.
So your comment, as I understand it, is, and I think we all agree, all the clinicians on this group and anybody that's been a patient, sick care is a hospital is a dangerous place to be. There are a lot of medical errors. A lot is a relative term compared to some other industries, like you said. But if I understand your point, why are we overemphasizing the downside of AI when there's so much upside to be gained? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one point. And then it's also a starting position, right? So a lot of this thesis of like, oh, AI could kind of mess things up. It's like, mess what up? The current system we have, which is not terribly effective in many ways. So it's kind of two things, right? It's like, one is, are we overemphasizing the potential downside? But two, are we in a sustainable system now to not be able to be open to experimentation? I think you can't have your cake and eat it too, frankly.
Right.
So
well,
that's sort of where I'm
my response to that is because you're going to get sued.
Or you're getting sued today anyways.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the door blows off the Boeing airplane. Which passenger sued the pilot? None. if that happens in the hospital, guess what? I get sued because the door blew off the airplane. So there's a reason. Now, Dale, your response or anybody else?
Yeah, but I think that's an edge case, right? Like you're talking about an edge case. So
I am not talking no, I'm not talking about an edge case. No, I've been sued twice. Every doctor over 55, not everyone, a significant percentage of doctors. I don't know whether Anthony, how many times you've been sued. And I know that we both, Anthony and myself, and probably others on the call, have participated on the defense and prosecution side as experts, not just in med-mal, but also in product liability. So this is a much more complicated and regulated environment, and scary, frankly, environment. So that's my 2 cents. Dale?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, because I think that as Arlen, as you said, the point that Fahad is raising is a really compelling, which is there is so much good that can be done here. You know, why are we kind of starting off on our back foot? But Arlen, as you note, there is a good reason, right? And there's a very specific sort of liability reason that certainly for clinicians is front and center, and something of legitimate concern. The way that I kind of I look at this is that excuse me, one of the kind of, there are two dynamics at work that inform, I think, this comment and our responses to it. So the first is that clinicians, by and large, even when they're working for larger clinics or for hospitals themselves, are not always tuned in to the significant amount of research and analysis that a health system may do around these technologies. They're simply fed in a little bit of information, but they're not a part of the conversation, right? So in a situation where a health system, there's a really good Wall Street Journal article about this, I think last year, about health systems that are asking their clinicians to utilize certain technology, and the clinicians get uncomfortable with what they view as potentially deferring some of their professional judgment to some technology that they don't think necessarily is right all of the time. But the hospital's kind of taking a global view, saying, well, if everybody adheres to best practices, everything, we're going to get better on the aggregate. There's this tension, right, between what a clinician in the moment might know and understand about a technology that is being utilized, and the potential outcome, and what the collective we or various stakeholders might view as the appropriate behavior. So there is this constant tension, I think, in our modern version of healthcare between the perspective of what's going to be good for everybody versus what's going to be good in a particular instance, right? And how we move, and I think AI is a big piece of this, from kind of these global perspectives on healthcare to true precision medicine is going to be a painful process. And I think this point is one of those points, right? The other dynamic here that is really interesting, and I think Harvey began to hint at this with his earlier comments, is that, and I'm sure all of you as clinicians have dealt with this, is patients are much more informed and are using these technologies. And sometimes their information is good, sometimes their information is bad, sometimes they're using technology that's good, sometimes they're using technology that's bad. But they come into now the clinical setting with a very different set of trust dynamics at work, right? So I go in, I see my clinician, I say, Dr. Meyers, my watch is telling me X, Y, and Z. And Dr. Meyers says, well, how do I know whether any of that's true? I don't know what your watch is. I don't know whether it's been cleared by FDA to give you this information or these conclusions. And so I got to reach my own conclusion. I've got to do my own investigation as a clinician to figure this out. And I may say to Dr. Meyers, well, what makes you think that you're smarter than the biggest technology company in the world, right? These guys know what they're doing. They're changing the world. And you're telling me you're not going to listen to them? that's a terrible dynamic at work within the clinical setting. And it changes significantly the way that clinicians engage with patients, the expectations that patients have with their clinicians, and their level of trust with those clinicians. And it increases the risk associated with people making claims for unmet expectations or actually things going wrong. So when we're talking about these things, and this to me is what is most concerning about this technology, and our biggest hurdle right now is, how do we figure out the ways to effectively integrate these technologies into the clinical setting without exposing clinicians to increased amounts of risk, and making sure that patients truly understand what it is they think they know, right? Going into that setting, because I think that's really where that liability potential really exists.
So Anthony, you're in the clinic and you're using AI, and patients are telling you they have arrhythmias and God knows what, and you're getting alarms and a lot of false positives. And so, to Dale's very point, I mean, you're involved with this every day in the clinic. So what is your response to what he said?
Well, I was putting in the chat that, yes, I think both Dale and Fahad are absolutely spot on, that there's this general raising the baseline care issue with AI, and then there's the individual case where you can go right or wrong with AI. And I do think that we can't necessarily mix the two, because the two have very, very different, excuse the pun here, algorithms for sorting it out. And I'm thankful to Sri for before he left for putting those cases. I weren't aware of those cases that are ongoing, and you may not even be aware, Dale, but it seems like some things are happening. So far below the radar that you and I have, which are pretty big. So I do think that day to day, I think I use it quite aggressively, and I think to improve patient care, because there are things that I cannot come up with that the AI tool will be able to remind me as a pediatric cardiologist to do, and that in my mind improves the quality of diagnosis and care. Now, at some point, Dale, I think someone's going to say, well, that's going to be any reasonably prudent physician would do in any situation, is plus AI, not without AI. And I think that day is going to come soon, because I would want my doctors to use AI, because I think lots of times they don't come up with the best plans or the best diagnosis. And there's so many, as Fahad was saying, there's so many examples of that we're going to be just more and more vulnerable without it, I think. So
Arlen, can I just respond
sure.
very quickly to Anthony's comment, because I think it's a great comment, and it goes back to what makes AI different than other things that we utilize, other bits of technology. But I think really the question we should be asking is not how is AI or these instances of AI like a stethoscope. It's really more, how are these instances of AI like a set of best practices, or like a consult with a fellow clinician, right? Because that's really a much more, in my mind, useful analysis than thinking about it in those terms, because these are diagnostic tools, they are treatment tools, they are giving us conclusions as opposed to additional facts. And I think when we think about it in those terms, what Anthony is saying about the I'll call it the hybrid integration of this sort of technology into medical care, that really is the way forward, particularly right now. That's going to be the standard of care in the future. I agree completely. But the key to all of that is understanding, clinicians truly understanding the technology that they're using, what it can be used for, what it shouldn't be used for, really what its edge cases are for, so that they have confidence in using it and they're not going beyond, what they should be using it for, which quite frankly, we've seen with generative AI tools this past year, all of those problems when you start utilizing it with the wrong expectations.
Right. So, Deepu, I'm interested in your comments. So you're coming at this from the perspective of an advanced practice professional, educator, et cetera. And so so the issues are, some states you have to be under the supervision of a physician, other states you don't. And so and the argument is, well, if you don't have to be under the supervision of a physician, then maybe artificial intelligence is the guide on the side, the Sherpa, the co-pilot, whatever you want to call it. So what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much what everyone has been saying here in terms of using AI. I akin it to, Dale, you were saying that, the colleague part of AI rather than a stethoscope. It's like us practicing without up to date when we're early in our clinical careers and not knowing what to put in. Except I think it's better because with tools like Up to Date, where we can search terms, we actually have to know a diagnosis that we have to have in mind in order to look up something, rather than saying, here are the symptoms, tell me what I'm missing. To the point that I made earlier, Arlen, around clinical decision support, I think what we're going to end up having is what we have similar to prescribing practices now in EMRs, where we have hard stops in our workflows. When we write a prescription, it'll say, hey, are you sure you want to write this prescription? Oh, you'll have to override it. And I think we'll have a similar practice style to what Anthony's practicing now, which is, I take a history, I'm going to put it in here. This is the stop. Did you check the algorithm? Okay, great. Now, if you've added the physical exam, hard stop, what are you doing? Here are more diagnostics. Stop, check with the AI. I think that's going to be the new practice style, which will give us a balance of humans kind of knowing when to override certain decisions from an algorithm, but also allowing the algorithm to be part of that clinical decision support that we do need. And so from a advanced practice point of view, I think it will help, and I think it will alleviate a lot of the burdens that I think supervising physicians feel in terms of signing off on documents and things like that. I mean, granted, I've practiced for now 20 plus years. I have a really great relationship with the physicians I've worked with my entire career. But, the new generation is a little bit different in their practice style. They're learning differently, and we're going to have to adapt to how we teach them. Because right now we're in this space of, great, everything's going to be, they're just going to be given everything, and they're not actually going to learn how to critically apply the medicine. And that's, I will say, I see that a lot in faculty here at my institution. I'm sure you guys are seeing it at your various places of practice. But really, that gap that we have right now between where this technology is and is already taking off, and the current faculty we have who are not prepared to teach this generation who is already coming up and using this technology. That gap is going to take us a while to close, I think.
So there's 2 points that have been brought up. I just want to, or actually 3. One is I put a link to an article that I actually sent Dale earlier this morning that I thought was pretty good about rethinking workflow and engineering the workflow. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, the basic bottom line is you can't, if you don't rethink the workflow because artificial intelligence is different, it's just garbage in, garbage out, and it doesn't work. The second point is, in terms of Fahad's comment, this issue of entrepreneurs creating something that they want to sell into a hospital system gets to the issue that we've been discussing. Convince me that your product won't get me sued. And I just don't think you can blow that off. I mean, that's a concern that people have, and I just don't think vendors do a good enough job convincing people that my product won't get you sued. The third point I want to make is that, and maybe we're going to have to end this soon, but maybe, Dale, you can address this briefly. So it has to do with the make or buy decision as far as artificial intelligence in a healthcare system. The whole issue of how do you vet a company and subject them to an advisory services agreement and their liability and their contractual obligations and all the things that Dale mentioned in the very beginning. But what about if you do this internally? What about if you do this, you have an internal artificial intelligence group, center of excellence, whatever you want to call it. And that's happening more and more, thanks in part to efforts like Anthony and others. People are beginning to develop this stuff internally. So what are there different risk mitigation strategies when it comes to designing, developing, and deploying an internally created AI product? So Dale, what are your just brief thoughts about that?
Sure, and I see someone has their hand up, so I will be brief to make sure we can get to Brian there. But certainly when you're developing something internally, the risk mitigation strategies that you take are different than when you are working with a vendor to bring the technology in. When you're bringing technology into an organization, you're working with a vendor who has presumably already developed the tool. It is a thing in and of itself. They're going to make certain representations about it. They're going to sell you on certain things and then maybe pull back a little bit on their sales pitch when it comes to contracting. So there's a dynamic at work, and basic contracts terms come into play. When you develop the technology internally, you have more control over what I tend to think of as the more important risk mitigation strategies, which are the development of the technology itself, which requires, particularly if we're talking about technology that's going to be utilized in a clinical setting, that feedback loop from the clinicians and presumably also from the patients in some circumstances, so that in the development of the technology, you're addressing the things that could be problematic along the way. The second thing that you have control over that you don't necessarily have as much control over in the vendor circumstance is making sure you have real education and buy-in from the clinicians in terms of the technology. So they understand it completely, they understand what its limitations are, but also they're using it, and they're using it in the right ways, right? They're using it the way that it really should be utilized. And honestly, those are, from my perspective, the most significant things an organization can focus on when it comes to risk mitigation. Nobody is out there trying to develop, vendors included, right? Trying to develop tools that are going to injure people, right? Problems come up because people don't understand what they're doing, or they have the wrong expectation about it. And so really controlling that as in the design process, as well as the deployment process, and then in the implementation process, is critical to risk mitigation. And when you're developing something internally, is something you can control.
Great. Thanks for that. Brian, we have 3 minutes. You have the final question or word.
Try to be brief. I know we moved past this slightly, but it seemed to me with the pilot airplane analogy that the pilot is in a position, I don't know how it would be stated legally, but more proximate and at risk for riding the platform. They're in a position similar to the passengers. They can suffer harm from it, whereas Arlen, say with a surgical robotics and surgery or AI platform, it's in a more intercessory position with the patient, maybe bearing more of the risk of harm, just like with a stethoscope or whatever. If it's misused or not understood, the doctor is probably not going to get hurt. They might get hurt emotionally, but it's a different balance.
Well, doesn't that come down to duty, breach, causation, and damages? I mean, what is the fiduciary duty of an airline pilot versus a surgeon? And somebody in a courtroom is going to figure that out, but I don't. But I think that's the issue. And when it because of the tort law, duty, breach, causation, damage, then you have to figure out, well, do doctors have a duty to protect their patients and place them first? You bet. Did they breach that fiduciary responsibility when they used AI? Who knows? Figure it out in court. Well, if you make the same argument with an airline pilot, I mean, it's the same argument. If you don't teach people how to use artificial intelligence in medical school, are you committing educational malpractice? The answer is no. You can't sue a teacher because they do not have a fiduciary responsibility to make people learn. They just throw the stuff out there and you can use it or not. So there's so many nuances to this, and that's why they pay Dale the big bucks to figure it out. So Dale, do you have a final word? Because we got to quit.
Real quick, I think the airline analogy is interesting, and I think for those of you who really are interested in kind of how institutions deal with artificial intelligence, well or not, is to take a look at the reports coming out of the Boeing, the autopilot disasters that happen, and the level of education, training, quite frankly, corruption at a certain level, I think you could call it. And we're talking about lots of different institutions here, so this is not all just focused on Boeing, but it's a really good example of how AI governance and all these issues that we're talking about, training, education, really play out in the real world with real, very significant consequences. And it's the same thing in a microcosm when you're in a doctor's office dealing with a patient.
Yeah, this is great. Well, this is
Can I just quickly add, Arlen, that the large language models are missing one key fundamental element, which is the wisdom from all the clinicians. Once that's incorporated, then by definition, AI will be the standard of care and way above that standard of care.
Great. Everybody, great comments. Hope you enjoyed this. Dale, thanks a lot. We look forward to seeing you at AI Med in Orlando for more of your wisdom. And thanks to everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.